At my daughter's wedding, her arrogant fiancé grabbed the back of my neck and smashed my face into the four-tier wedding cake. He laughed into the microphone and said, "Try some dessert, Beggar. Let us not have people saying I let my father-in-law starve." The crowd gasped. But before I even wiped the frosting from my eyes, the most ruthless real estate tycoon on the East Coast jumped from the VIP table, pointed a shaking finger at him, and shouted, "Are you out of your mind? He is a billionaire." The fiancé went as pale as a ghost. What he had no way of knowing was that just 3 hours earlier, I had quietly and deliberately bought out every single dime of his enormous secret debt. I downshifted the heavy manual transmission of my battered 2003 Chevy Silverado. The old engine let out its familiar comforting groan as I worked my way up the steep, perfectly manicured winding driveway leading to a lavish Kiowa Island estate. The hands wrapped around my worn steering wheel were thick-weathered and deeply calloused, the hands of a man who had poured 40 years into constructing a global shipping and commercial real estate empire, starting from absolutely nothing except a single weathered tugboat on the freezing docks of Charleston. I did not inherit a single dollar of what I have. I bled for every cent. I gave up my youth, surrendered my sleep, and in the end, I sacrificed my marriage, all of it laid on the altar of building an unshakable fortress of security for the people I loved. And yet, through all of it, I never once felt the pull to show the world what I had accumulated. I still climbed into my old truck every morning, the same as I always had. Welcome, friends. You've found your way to Honor Revenge Stories, and I'm glad you're here. Before we get into today's story, drop a quick comment below, just one line, and tell me what you think a man does when the people who were supposed to love him treat him like he's invisible. Go ahead, I'd love to read your thoughts. Now, a word before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of telling it well, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. I still polished my own boots. Resting on the cracked leather of the passenger seat beside me was the wedding invitation. Heavy stock, excessively expensive, raised gold foil lettering pressed into every line. An invitation to the wedding of my only child, my daughter Sloane. We had been deeply estranged for the past 15 years, ever since my bitter divorce from her mother, Renata. Renata was a woman who loved the idea of wealth and high society far more than she ever loved the man who labored day and night to provide it. When we split, she went to work, poisoning my daughter's mind against me, painting me as a work-obsessed mechanic who cared more about cargo ships than his own family. Tucked inside that elegant, shimmering envelope was a small yellow sticky note. It carried no warmth, no excitement from my daughter. It was a hurried scrawl from Renata. It read, "Try to look decent, Garrett. Stand in the back." I left my beaten-up truck near the far edge of the lot, deliberately tucking it out of sight in the shadows between gleaming Porsche's imported Mercedes and chauffeur-driven luxury SUVs. I cut the engine and let the silence settle over me for a brief moment. Then I stepped out, drew a slow breath of salty ocean air, and smoothed down the lapels of my suit. It was a clean, well-pressed navy suit from JCPenney that I had bought 15 years ago. My boots were old steel-toed work boots. I had polished them to a shine, but they carried deep scuffs at the toes from decades of walking cargo ship decks. They were comfortable, and more than that, they anchored me, a constant reminder of exactly who I was and where I had come from. I made my way toward the grand, towering entrance of the estate. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts scrambled to hold doors open for women wrapped in designer gowns and men strutting in tailored tuxedos. The wealth on display was almost deafening. But to a man who genuinely has money, that kind of loud, desperate flaunting always reads as performance. As I climbed the sweeping stone steps, a younger man stepped squarely into my path and blocked my way. He was impeccably turned out in a custom-fitted navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. His hair was slicked back perfectly, his posture radiating the particular arrogance of a man who has never truly earned anything. This was Derek Ashford, the man my daughter was about to marry. I had never formally met him, thanks to Renata keeping me entirely cut off from Sloane's adult life, but I recognized his face from the handful of photographs I had come across online. Derek looked me over, top to bottom. His eyes swept across my outdated suit and dropped immediately to my scuffed work boots. A look of undisguised contempt moved across his face, as though I had tracked filth into his personal kingdom. He sneered, letting out a short, dismissive sigh. Without a word of greeting or any basic human courtesy, He reached into his tailored jacket, produced a set of keys on a heavy leather fob, and thrust them toward my chest. "Here, take the keys to my car," he said, his voice soaked in condescension. "Be careful with the clutch. It is worth more than your life. Park it near the front so my guests can see it." I did not reach for the keys. I kept my hands resting quietly at my sides. I stood perfectly still, spine straight, and held his gaze. I let the silence between us stretch and thicken, watching irritation crawl across his polished face as my refusal to comply registered. "I am not the valet," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and unhurried, the voice of a man who has negotiated with ruthless union bosses and international tycoons without blinking. "My name is Garrett Wynn. I am Sloane's father." The keys slipped from his fingers and rang out against the stone driveway. For just a heartbeat, the arrogant smirk drained completely from Derek's face. He stood there blinking, caught flat-footed staring at me, the way a man stares at something unwelcome that has turned up somewhere it doesn't belong. But the shock didn't hold. Within moments, his rehearsed smile climbed back into place, tight-strained, stripped of any genuine warmth. "Right," he chuckled nervously, crouching to snatch the keys off the cold stone. "Sloane mentioned you might actually show up. I just didn't expect you to look so authentic." He did not extend his hand. He offered no acknowledgement of the man who had brought his future bride into the world. Instead, he turned and snapped his fingers at a security guard posted near the heavy wooden doors. The guard trotted over, looking wary. "Keep a close eye on the old man," Derek instructed, making no effort to lower his voice. "Make sure he doesn't wander into the VIP lounge or start pestering the catering staff for free food. We have important, very wealthy investors arriving shortly, and we cannot afford any embarrassing distractions." The guard gave me a cautious, almost apologetic look and nodded. Derek turned his back without another glance and crossed toward a cluster of well-heeled guests laughing loudly and clapping shoulders, as though I had already ceased to exist. I stood on those steps, the cold ocean breeze moving against my face. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply watched him walk away. That single brief exchange told me everything I needed to know. A man who greets a stranger with that depth of contempt, purely on the assumption that he has no money, is a man concealing something very dark and very fragile behind his expensive clothes. I reached into my pocket and felt the smooth surface of my encrypted satellite phone. The wedding weekend had barely started, and already Derek Ashford had made the gravest mistake of his life. The game was moving. The grand dining hall of the estate was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm glow, above tables draped in imported silk. Towering floral centerpieces dripped with rare orchids that cost more than a working family's monthly grocery bill. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, lending a polished backdrop to the clinking of champagne flutes and the boastful laughter of the coastal elite. It was exactly the hollow theatrical spectacle of wealth that Renata had always craved. I located my assigned seat, a small, unsteady chair, pushed into the furthest corner of that cavernous room, positioned directly beside the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. Every few minutes, a waiter exploded through those doors, trailing a rush of hot air and the clattering chaos of crashing plates. I had been seated as far from Sloane and the wedding party as the room would allow. They had tucked me in the shadows on purpose, hoping I would go unseen. It was a deliberate insult engineered to make me feel profoundly unwelcome. I pulled out the chair and sat down without a word, resting my calloused hands on my knees. I did not complain to the staff. A man who is truly certain of his own worth never has to demand a seat at the center of the room. I watched the elite guests work the space around me. To them, I was nothing but an old man in an outdated suit with scuffed boots, an unfortunate blemish on an otherwise spotless aesthetic canvas. Then Derek's family made their entrance. They swept to their places at the head tables, but not before threading deliberate paths past my dark corner. Derek's mother, draped in ostentatious jewelry, dropped her gaze to my boots and let out a sharp gasp. She leaned into her sister and whispered at a volume designed to carry, "Can you believe he wore those hideous work boots to a formal dinner? It is absolutely disgraceful. Derek is being kind, just allowing that riffraff inside the building." They discussed me as though I were either deaf or too insignificant to register their cruelty. A familiar, steady calm settled across my mind. In 40 years of building a global logistics empire from nothing, I had faced down ruthless international cartel bosses and come out standing. The The petty snickering of these sheltered socialites registered as less than nothing. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of water. Fools always laugh the loudest right before the ground drops out from under them. My ex-wife Renata made her way across the room in a sleek designer gown, her face arranged into a polished smile. But as she neared my table, the smile evaporated, replaced by a cold, set glare. She stopped at my chair, her posture stiff with old resentment. "I told you to stand in the back, Garrett," she said, her voice sinking to a venomous murmur. "But you just had to come inside and ruin the aesthetic. You look like someone who wandered in off the street. I am only here for my daughter." Before I could say a word, she reached into her expensive silver clutch and produced a crisp folded $100 bill. With a sharp, aggressive motion, she shoved the money into the breast pocket of my old J.C. Penney suit. She patted the pocket twice, a condescending little gesture that made my jaw go tight. "Take that money," she whispered, her voice laced with venom. "Use it for gas on your way back to whatever trailer park you're currently calling home. Leave early tomorrow. We do not need your poverty dragging down the wedding photos." She spun on her heels and marched back toward the bright lights, expecting me to erupt, so she'd have grounds to throw me out entirely. I did not give her that satisfaction. I calmly reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the folded bill. I smoothed the sharp creases flat against the table. At that moment, a young busboy came bursting through to the swinging kitchen doors, hauling an enormous tray of dirty dishes, his arms shaking under the load. He looked no older than 19, exhausted, stressed, completely invisible to the laughing, wealthy guests surrounding him. I remembered what it was to be that boy. I remembered pulling consecutive double shifts on the freezing docks of Charleston Harbor, hands bleeding, scraping together, just enough to keep the heat on. Back in those days, a single bill could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. Real wealth has nothing to do with an offshore account. It lives in knowing the punishing worth of hard labor. I never forgot where I came from. As the young busboy rushed by my table, I quietly slid that crisp $100 bill beneath the edge of his tray. He stopped dead, staring down at it in disbelief. He looked up at me, eyes wide with gratitude. I gave him a small nod and pressed a finger to my lips. He mouthed a silent thank you and disappeared back into the chaos of the kitchen. With that settled, I turned my attention to the center of the room. Derek was holding court at the main table, completely surrounded by an eager audience putting on the performance of a lifetime. He waved aggressively at the waitstaff, demanding they bring over 4 more bottles of vintage champagne. Those bottles cost $200 apiece. He poured freely, laughing loud and wide, playing the role of the careless, untouchable billionaire hedge fund manager to absolute perfection. But a man who has spent decades reading human behavior sees what ordinary people miss entirely. I watched Derek with care. My eyes tracked his every movement, peeling away the expensive, shiny armor of his performance piece by piece. The head waiter came up behind him and leaned down to quietly present a leather-bound booklet with the preliminary charges for the rehearsal dinner. Derek kept the wide, arrogant smile nailed to his face for his audience. But the moment he cracked that leather folder open and clocked the final total, I caught it. A microscopic reaction yet to my trained eye, it landed like a gunshot. The muscles along his jawline seized. The color bled slightly from his cheeks. His hand trembled a fraction of an inch before he clenched the glass harder to cover it. He fired a quick, hunted glance around the room, the look of a cornered animal searching for a way out. He scrawled his name on the receipt and shoved the booklet back at the waiter, with unnecessary force, his fake smile returning a beat too late. I settled back into my wobbly chair by the kitchen doors as the roar of the party faded into the background of my thoughts. My gut rang out loud, sharp, and impossible to ignore. The lavish theatrical spending, the hollow aggression of his arrogance, the naked terror in his eyes over a simple dinner bill. This man was no billionaire. He was sinking fast, and my only daughter was about to lash herself to his doomed ship. I waited until Derek was briefly swallowed up by a cluster of fawning bridesmaids before I made my move. I pushed up from my unsteady chair and threaded through the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos in search of my daughter. I found Sloane standing near a towering arrangement of white orchids. She looked breathtaking in her evening gown, but there was a subtle tension riding her shoulders, a stiffness that had no place on a bride the night before her wedding. I moved toward her slowly, my heavy boots making a soft thud on the polished hardwood. When she spotted me, she stiffened further. She shot a quick, nervous glance over my shoulder to check whether anyone important was watching. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. You should probably stay seated. The parents are circulating. I just wanted to give you this, I replied gently, keeping my voice steady in spite of the cold reception. I reached into the side pocket of my suit jacket and drew out a small, intricately carved wooden jewelry box made from rich walnut, the very same wood I had salvaged from the first commercial cargo ship I ever purchased decades ago. I had spent the last 3 weeks sanding it by hand in my private workshop, buffing the surface until the grain caught the light like glass. I had engraved her initials on the lid the same way I used to carve her name into the little wooden blocks she played with as a child. Long before the bitter divorce tore our daily lives apart, I held it out to her. I made it for you to keep your new ring safe. Sloane looked down at the box. For one fleeting instant, a flicker of genuine unguarded warmth moved across her face. She remembered. But the warmth was immediately swamped by the wave of embarrassment. Her eyes swept the crowded room again, in near panic. Rather than opening the box, she snatched it from my hands and tried to force it into her small designer clutch. It didn't fit. She fumbled with it, her cheeks flushing red with shame. "Thank you, Dad," she mumbled, eyes fixed on the floor. "I'll put it away later. Just please go sit down before Derek sees us together." It was already far too late. Heavy, deliberate footsteps closed in from behind. A thick cloud of expensive designer cologne announced Derek Ashford's arrival before he even spoke. "What do we have here?" Derek asked loudly, his voice cutting clean through the soft background music. He stepped between Sloane and me, cold eyes locking onto the walnut box still clutched in her trembling hands. "It is absolutely nothing," Sloane stammered, shrinking visibly under his hard, controlling stare. "Just a very small gift from my father." Derek did not ask permission. He reached out and snatched the wooden box straight from her hands. He lifted it toward the chandelier, light turning it with exaggerated, mocking scrutiny. A cruel, patronizing smile crawled slowly across his clean-shaved face. "Did you make this yourself, old man?" he asked, rotating the box carelessly between his fingers. "It looks like something you'd find at a cheap flea market or a dusty garage sale." I kept my expression entirely neutral, hands folded quietly in front of me. "I carved it from solid walnut. It is a family tradition." Derek threw his head back in a loud theatrical laugh, designed to pull the attention of every wealthy guest within earshot. "A tradition," he repeated, shaking his head in performed pity. "Well, Sloane and I have much better traditions now. Traditions that come in beautiful little blue boxes from Tiffany & Co. We do not really have room in our stunning new penthouse for homemade arts and crafts." Sloane looked away, utterly unable to meet my eyes. She did not defend me. She did not ask for the box back. She just stood there in passive silence, paralyzed by fear of upsetting the man she believed was her wealthy savior. Derek turned toward a passing waiter, carrying a tray of fresh drinks. He lifted a heavy crystal glass of dark, expensive whiskey and took a long, arrogant pull, then looked back at me with a smirk dripping with contempt. Without breaking eye contact for even a second, he set the small walnut box down on a nearby cocktail table. Then, with slow and deliberate disrespect, he pressed his cold-sweating whiskey glass directly onto the intricately carved lid. "It makes a fantastic coaster, though," Derek said, a vicious, triumphant glint in his eye. "Thanks for the little contribution, Garrett. Now, if you will excuse us, we have actual guests to entertain tonight." The condensation from the glass was already seeping into the polished wood, threatening to undo the countless hours of labor I had poured into it. Every raw instinct in my body, every ounce of power I commanded as a man who had dominated boardrooms and crushed hostile takeovers without breaking a sweat, screamed at me to seize him by his custom-tailored collar and dismantle his counterfeit world right then and there. But I held back. A predator never strikes while the prey is still testing its limits. I needed him to feel completely untouchable. I drew a slow, measured breath and prepared to lift the heavy glass off the box and simply walk away. But before I could extend my hand, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The disruption did not come from me. A man shoved his way past the elegant floral arrangements and cut a direct path toward our small corner. He was not an invited guest. He wore a cheap, heavily scuffed leather jacket over a dark, wrinkled t-shirt. His face was deeply weathered, his nose slightly crooked, and his eyes carried the flat, cold stare of a man whose profession was collecting dangerous debts. He paid no attention to the surrounding socialites and walked straight up behind Derek. Without a word, the man in the leather jacket reached out and seized Derek's tailored shoulder in a brutal grip. Derek spun around, fast mouth already open to unleash his arrogant fury on whoever had dared to touch him. But the instant Derek's eyes landed on that face, his mask shattered completely. The color evacuated his features, leaving him ash pale. His jaw trembled. The booming voice he had used to humiliate me just moments before vanished into thin air without a trace. He had nothing. The man shoved Derek forward. Derek stumbled, eyes wide with raw terror, as the stranger forced him into a dark, empty hallway just behind us. I watched the door swing shut, cutting off the light. The music played on a soft, detached melody that felt utterly disconnected from the violence I had just witnessed. Not one person in the room appeared to have noticed a thing. The wealthy guests went on clinking their champagne flutes and laughing, completely blind to the fact that the groom had just been manhandled by a thug in a leather jacket. I shifted my attention back to Sloane. She stood stiffly beside the floral arrangement, nervously smoothing the fabric of her gown. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes anchored to the hardwood floor. She had witnessed the exchange, yet she worked furiously to project the impression that nothing unusual had just taken place. I moved toward her, slowly keeping my voice low, and even so, as not to startle her. I asked her who that man was and why he had grabbed Derek with such force. Sloane composed her face into a bright, artificial smile before turning to meet my eyes. When she did, her gaze was fiercely defensive, armored by years of the status-obsessed conditioning her mother had built into her. She let out a short, dismissive laugh and waved her hand through the air. "Oh, that is just a frustrated contractor," she said, smoothly delivering the lie with the practiced precision of someone who had been handed a very specific script. "Derek manages a $50 million hedge fund, Dad. He is a very important man in the financial district. People are constantly after him for investments, and sometimes they get a little too desperate when he turns them down." I listened to every word in silence. A $50 million hedge fund manager does not get shoved into dark hallways by frustrated contractors. A man with $50 million commands a security detail, or at least the confidence to hold his ground in public. Derek had folded like wet paper, his eyes screaming primal terror. But Sloane desperately wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, to protect the fragile fantasy she had built her future on. She raised her chin, slipping into that familiar posture Renata had long since perfected. "Derek is dealing with incredibly high stakes all the time," she continued, her voice taking on a condescending edge. "It is a completely different world from what you are used to, Dad. He carries enormous pressure because he is building a real empire for our future." Before I could push back on the obvious gaps in her story, Sloane lifted her left hand with quiet, deliberate pride. She spread her fingers outward, angling them to catch the full blaze of the crystal chandelier overhead. Resting on her ring finger was an enormous stone, easily 3 carats, set in a thick platinum band that sat heavy and conspicuous on her hand. She gazed at it with an expression of pure reverence, treating it not as a symbol of love, but as a gleaming trophy announcing her new social position. "Derek had it custom made just for me," she said, her voice carrying a smug, elevated certainty. "He wanted to make sure I had the absolute best. He told me that a woman of my caliber deserves a diamond that commands respect the moment she walks into any room." I looked from the stone to my daughter's face. The hard, dismissive glare she leveled at me was a precise reflection of her mother. Then came the blow she had been building toward. "He is giving me a life you never could, Dad," she said coolly. "A life where I never have to worry about smelling like motor oil or settling for second best. You could learn a great deal about success from a man like him." I swallowed the bitter pain that surged up from somewhere deep in my chest. There is a particular kind of agony in hearing your own child speak to you with that quality of contempt. It settles on you, like a physical weight pressing the air out of your lungs. I had spent 40 years sacrificing my comfort, grinding through 80-hour weeks to build a global shipping network from nothing, so she would never have to feel the stranglehold of poverty. And yet, here she stood, utterly convinced that my worn work boots were a mark of failure rather than the very foundation beneath her privileged life. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend the account balance she had no idea existed. Instead, I focused entirely on the stone on her left hand. "May I see it?" I asked, keeping my voice mild and unhurried. Sloane hesitated, a beat visibly thrown by the absence of any defensive reaction to her insult. She reluctantly extended her hand a few inches toward my face, arm held stiff and cautious. I leaned in close, narrowing my eyes as I examined the stone under the unforgiving glare of the chandelier. In the late 1990s, my international shipping company had secured a major contract, transporting raw diamonds directly from South Africa to the most elite jewelers across the country. For 5 solid years, I personally oversaw every detail of those multi-million-dollar shipments. I spent long hours in secured vaults alongside master gemologists, studying the precise characteristics that distinguish a genuine diamond from everything else. I learned about internal fire, the specific aggressive way a real stone bends and refracts, light throwing brilliant flashes of deep color from its core. I stared hard at the stone on Sloane's finger. It was undeniably large cut, with mathematical precision and flawless to any untrained eye. But as the chandelier light moved across its facets, my instincts fired immediately. The refraction was wrong. Rather than the fierce internal brilliance of a real diamond, the light coming off the stone was flat, glassy, and dead. There was no fire inside it. It shone brilliantly on the surface, but beneath that surface there was nothing. It was a well-cut piece of cubic zirconia. It was completely fake. My heart dropped like a stone through water, heavy with the weight of what I now understood. The truth arrived with the force of a freight train at full speed. My daughter was not simply marrying an arrogant and unpleasant man. She was binding her entire life and future to a dangerous, desperate fraud. A man who boasted to crowds about a $50 million hedge fund, yet could not pay for a genuine diamond for his bride. A man who had allowed himself to be physically threatened by a street-level debt collector in the middle of a well-guarded Kiowa Island estate. The counterfeit ring, the terror in his eyes, the aggressive bravado, paper-thin over his panic. It was all a fragile, elaborately constructed house of cards built on desperate lies. And Sloane was standing at its very center. I had to move. Now. I released Sloane's hand gently, letting her step back into the shelter of her constructed illusion. She smoothed her silk gown, gave me a guarded nod, and slipped away into the sea of tailored tuxedos. I stood alone near the floral arrangements, letting the reality settle over me like cold water. My only daughter was marching into a burning building, and she was fiercely defending the arsonist who lit the match. I turned and walked back to my isolated chair by the swinging kitchen doors. The jazz trio had stopped playing their music, replaced by the sharp ring of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The low hum of elite conversation faded into expectant silence. At the front of the grand hall, perfectly framed beneath the largest chandelier, stood Derek Ashford. He held the glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a wireless microphone in the other, radiating the toxic manufactured confidence that only a desperate man can produce. He let the room go completely quiet before he spoke, savoring every second of the assembled attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Derek began, his voice rolling through the speakers with practiced cadence. "Tomorrow, I marry the most beautiful woman in the world. But tonight, I want to talk about legacy. I want to talk about what it truly means to build an empire from the ground up, to be a man who shapes the future, rather than merely existing inside it." He moved back and forth across the front of the hall, making deliberate eye contact with the most affluent investors at the front tables. "Some of you know that my hedge fund has been aggressively pursuing a monumental commercial acquisition for the past 6 months," Derek continued. "It has been a grueling war of attrition against some of the oldest money in this city, but I'm incredibly proud to announce tonight in front of my future bride and my closest allies that we have finally closed the deal." The room broke into eager applause. Renata beamed from the front row, clapping with enthusiasm. Derek raised a hand to quiet them, a smug smile stretched across his face. "We just secured the primary commercial rights to the Meridian Tower on King Street," he declared, chest swelling. 50 stories of premium untouched Charleston real estate. An absolute crown jewel, and it is officially ours. The applause rose again louder. Derek let it build, feeding his fragile ego on every wave. Then his eyes swept the room. They bypassed the billionaires, the socialites, his beaming fiancée. They traveled all the way to the dark, isolated corner by the kitchen doors and locked directly onto me. The microphone caught his soft, mocking chuckle. "You know, building a legacy demands a certain kind of ruthless evolution," Derek said, his tone dropping into a condescending drawl. "It requires leaving the old ways behind. I look around this room and I see the absolute future, but I am also reminded of the pathetic past." He paused for effect, gesturing in my direction with his champagne flute. Some men work until they are 70 years old just to afford a rusted pickup truck and a cheap suit. The silence in the room turned heavy. They break their backs for decades. Derek continued, his voice soaked in venomous cruelty, convinced that grinding themselves into the dirt like peasants will somehow lead to greatness. But true greatness is not earned by blind, mindless labor. I made my first million at 25. I am acquiring city skyscrapers before I turn 35. Cheers to rapid evolution, and cheers to leaving the dinosaurs exactly where they belong, buried deeply in the past. He raised his glass high. Several of his groomsmen snickered, turning to stare directly at me in my dark corner. Renata let out a short, mocking laugh and lifted her crystal glass in enthusiastic agreement. The cruelty in that room was a suffocating blanket of elitist contempt aimed entirely at a man they believed to be a pitiful failure. I glanced over at Sloane. She was staring into her lap, face-pale hands clasped tightly together. She did not stand up. She did not defend the man who had worked freezing double shifts at the docks to cover her childhood medical bills. She simply accepted my public humiliation as the price of entry into Derek's imaginary kingdom. I did not shift in my uncomfortable seat. I did not look away, and I did not show a single flicker of embarrassment or anger. I calmly reached out, lifted my plain glass of ice water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold water moved smoothly down my throat, a perfect match for the freezing clarity that had just settled permanently into my veins. Derek Ashford was not a master of the financial universe. He was a deeply reckless, dangerously stupid child playing a game he did not remotely understand. I did not need a corporate background check to know he was lying about his grand commercial acquisition. I did not need my legal team to verify the operational status of the Meridian Tower on King Street. I knew exactly who owned that 50-story building. I had purchased the Meridian Tower 12 years ago, during a devastating market downturn. I gutted the entire structure, poured $60 million into renovating its commercial infrastructure, and placed it inside a private, heavily guarded holding trust strictly under the umbrella of Wynn Enterprises. I am the sole owner. There are no outside investors. There is no hedge fund consortium, and there is absolutely no active negotiation for its commercial rights with anyone, least of all a petty fraud like Derek Ashford. Derek had simply plucked the most impressive visible building he could think of to dazzle a room full of wealthy strangers. He had no idea that the building's actual owner was currently sitting at the worst table in the room, in a 15-year-old suit and steel-toed work boots. The lie was so staggeringly large, so trivially verifiable to anyone holding real corporate power, that it locked in my darkest suspicions beyond any remaining doubt. The scattered pieces snapped together sharply in my mind. Derek was drowning in dangerous debt. He had a violent street-level debt collector, crashing an exclusive rehearsal dinner. He had pawned a priceless sentimental family heirloom just to buy a fake cubic zirconia, and now he was fabricating multi-million-dollar real estate deals in front of a room full of people to prop up a crumbling illusion of wealth. He was not just lying to my daughter. He was lying to his investors, his supposed friends, and whatever criminal element he had been reckless enough to borrow millions from. The dominoes were already tipping, and Derek was dancing at the bottom of the chain, utterly oblivious to the destruction bearing down on him. He lifted his champagne again, basking in the warm glow of a kingdom he did not own. I set my water glass down on the table. The paternal anger that had briefly surged through me, dissolved, completely replaced by the cold, surgical focus of an apex predator preparing to dismantle its prey with precision. Let him drink his expensive champagne. Let him enjoy his borrowed applause. Let him believe he had humiliated a clueless old mechanic in front of the entire coastal elite. Tomorrow, the bill would come due, and I was going to collect every single penny. As the applause for his fabricated triumph finally faded, Derek raised his hand to quiet the room one more time. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced his sleek, expensive smartphone, studying the blank screen with exaggerated gravity furrowing his brow, as if an urgent message of the highest importance had just arrived and demanded his immediate attention. He leaned toward Sloane, murmured something in her ear, then addressed his captivated audience. "I am terribly sorry to interrupt the celebration," Derek announced, his voice projecting a performance of deep, reluctant regret. "But when duty calls, a man must answer. I have a scheduled conference call with a rather influential senator regarding upcoming financial legislation on Wall Street. An absolute nuisance, I know, but these elite political figures simply do not grasp the concept of a weekend off. Please enjoy the caviar and keep the champagne flowing. I will be back in just a moment. The guests murmured in impressed admiration at his supposed political connections. Renata nodded from the front row, eyes shining with greed as she regarded her future son-in-law. Derek pressed a practiced kiss to Sloane's cheek, straightened his expensive tie, and moved toward the exit. But I caught something the room full of admiring socialites missed entirely. The moment Derek turned his back to the crowd and walked briskly toward the heavy glass doors leading to the garden, his broad shoulders dropped. The confident, arrogant swagger dissolved with every step he took away from the lights. His breathing had gone shallow, and the fists swinging at his sides were wound tight. A man stepping away to take a routine call from a political ally carries himself with pride. A man walking toward a noose moves exactly the way Derek Ashford was moving right now. I counted out 30 full seconds before I pushed back my unsteady chair from the table. Nobody gave a second glance to the old mechanic easing quietly through the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen staff was too consumed with plating the next course to notice me threading through the narrow service corridor that opened directly onto the back gardens of the estate. The night air hit sharp and clean, carrying the briny bite of the Atlantic. The sprawling grounds were a maze of immaculately clipped hedges, pale marble statues, and murmuring stone fountains, all washed in the soft glow of landscape lighting. A beautiful, tranquil scene. But standing there in the dark, it felt like hunting territory. I stepped carefully onto the cobblestone path, the thick rubber soles of my old steel-toed work boots soaking up the sound. I moved in slow, deliberate steps, staying tucked inside the deep shadows thrown by the towering oaks. I did not have to search long. The frantic crunch of gravel reached me from a dim, secluded alcove near the far edge of the property line. I settled quietly behind a dense row of tall, manicured hedges. From that hidden vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the groom. Derek stood completely alone, but he was not holding the gleaming, expensive smartphone he had been flashing at the dinner table. Instead, he had a white-knuckled grip on a cheap disposable burner phone. His hands were shaking as he jabbed in a number. The change in him was genuinely jarring. The polished, untouchable billionaire was gone. What stood in his place was a terrified, cornered child. Sweat caught the pale moonlight on his forehead. He yanked frantically at the collar of his custom suit as though it were tightening around his throat. He paced the gravel path, chest heaving in deep, ragged pulls of air. He pressed the cheap phone to his ear, every muscle in his body coiled rigid. When the other end picked up, Derek did not speak with the commanding authority of a hedge fund manager. He spoke in the high, wavering pitch of a man pleading for his own survival. "Listen to me. You have to listen to me," Derek begged, his voice fracturing under the weight of pure desperation. "I know what the deadline was, but you cannot do this tonight. Not tonight. I am literally standing at my rehearsal dinner right now. The wedding is tomorrow. You just need to give me a little more time. I swear on my life, I have everything completely under control." A brief silence followed, while the person on the other end spoke. Whatever was said made Derek recoil as though he had taken a physical blow. He squeezed his eyes shut and raked a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, destroying the expensive look entirely. "I am not trying to avoid you," Derek hissed, his voice dropping into a frantic, hushed rasp. "I am telling you the absolute truth. I just need 48 more hours. That is all I am asking for. 48 hours. The moment I marry her tomorrow afternoon, the marital trust fund unlocks automatically. Her grandfather left her a substantial account, and as her husband, I will have full legal access to every last penny. You will get your $4 million back. I will even throw in a significant interest payment for the delay. Just please do not send anyone to the venue. You will blow the whole thing apart if you spook her family." Another heavy silence settled over the alcove. Derek absorbed the final chilling answer from his ruthless creditor. A desperate, defeated gasp escaped his lips. "Please do not do that," Derek begged, tears of raw terror welling in his eyes. "I will have the $4 million by Monday morning. I promise you. Just let me marry the girl." The line went dead. Derek stared at the burner phone in absolute horror. A raw, guttural sound tore up from somewhere deep in his chest. He hurled the cheap plastic device against the brick wall of the estate, with a violent snap, sending it apart in pieces. Then he drove his foot into a heavy landscaping stone, with everything he had, cursing loudly into the empty dark. He bent forward, palms on his knees, pulling in slow, shaking breaths as he tried to reassemble the shattered mask. I stood perfectly still behind the thick hedges wrapped in cold shadow. The blazing alarm my gut had been sounding had just been confirmed completely. Derek Ashford was not a successful businessman. He was a monumental fraud who owed 4 million tauzus to extraordinarily dangerous people. He was using my daughter, planning to drain her protective trust fund the instant the ink was dry on their marriage certificate. He saw Sloan as nothing more than a convenient, wealthy sacrifice to save his own miserable life. I turned quietly away from the alcove and made my way back toward the kitchen doors. I had heard everything I needed. The time for gathering quiet clues was finished. It was time to set in motion the plan that would shield my only daughter. I would tear down his counterfeit empire and make certain he'd never threatened my family again. The ruthless predator inside me was now completely awake. I slipped back along the garden path, leaving Derek to the wreckage of his reality. When I stepped into the grand dining hall, the mood had shifted entirely. The formal dinner service had wrapped up, and the wealthy guests were drifting toward the marble dance floor. I watched from the edges as Derek made his entrance. He strode back into the room, with that arrogant swagger, tugging his jacket straight and spreading an empty smile across his face. He caught Sloan by the waist and pulled her onto the dance floor. They spun beneath the crystal chandeliers, the picture of absolute perfection. To anyone who did not know better, he was a self-assured billionaire savoring his last night as a bachelor. But I knew what lay underneath. I knew that beneath the silken cologne, he was drenched in the terror of a man who owed $4 million to absolute monsters. But knowing the truth and making a brainwashed daughter believe it are two entirely different battles. Sloan had spent 2 years immersing herself in Derek's fantasy. She would not take the word of a father she had written off as a bitter old mechanic. If I walked up to her with nothing but an overheard phone call, she would go straight to Derek. He would likely talk her into eloping that very night, cutting me out of her life entirely, and locking down access to her trust fund. I needed physical, undeniable proof. Hard evidence that would shatter his illusions so completely that Sloan could not look away from what was standing in front of her. I turned from the dance floor and moved with purpose toward the grand foyer. I pushed through the front doors, leaving the music behind me. The driveway curved in a wide sweep of crushed gravel, lined on both sides with the most expensive luxury vehicles imaginable. I stood at the top of the stone steps, eyes moving across that glittering spread of automotive engineering. I was searching for one specific vehicle. Earlier that evening, Derek had burned a full 20 minutes loudly boasting to older investors about his brand new custom-ordered gleaming obsidian Porsche Cayenne. Every word out of his mouth was a carefully constructed lie designed to dazzle the wealthy guests around him. He had framed it as an impulse, a small reward to himself for closing the Charleston commercial acquisition. I spotted the gleaming obsidian Porsche Cayenne sitting prominently near the front of the VIP line. I walked down the stone steps and approached the valet stand. A young attendant came forward. I reached into my pocket and produced a crisp $100 bill. I folded it once and laid it across the wooden podium. I told the young man that my future son-in-law had accidentally left a critical wedding document locked inside his vehicle and that I needed 5 minutes alone with it to retrieve it. The valet glanced at the bill, then at my steady, unyielding expression. He slipped the money into his pocket, handed over the electronic key fob without a word, and turned to attend to another guest. I crossed to the Porsche Cayenne and pressed the unlock button. The headlights blinked sharply in the dark. I pulled the door open and leaned inside. To anyone walking past it was the ultimate symbol of financial success. But I had spent my entire life around engines and logistics. I know how to see past the shiny surface. I settled into the low driver's seat and popped the glove box open. A man who genuinely owns a high-performance vehicle keeps meticulous records. Registration, insurance documents, service warranties neatly filed. The glove box was nearly bare with a single brightly colored manila folder sitting inside it. I drew the folder out and clicked on the overhead dome light. I opened the cover and started reading. The logo printed at the top of the page did not belong to any exclusive dealership or premium leasing house. It belonged to a notoriously shady exotic car rental outfit operating on the outskirts of the city. I worked my eyes down the detailed rental agreement. Derek Ashford had not purchased this car. He had not even leased it. He had rented it strictly by the hour. The contract spelled out a rigid 24-hour rental window that had begun yesterday afternoon and would expire tomorrow morning right before the wedding ceremony. He had paid an extortionate predatory rate just to have the vehicle sitting in the valet line for a single evening, all to prop up a fragile illusion of wealth. I folded the rental agreement and tucked it carefully into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. But my instinct said there was more to uncover. A man running this scared always leaves a scattered trail of mistakes in his wake. I turned my attention to the rest of the cabin. As I leaned across to check the passenger side floorboard, my hand caught on a crumpled, heavily creased piece of bright yellow paper that had been shoved carelessly under the seat. I pulled it free and smoothed the sharp folds against my knee. I held it up to the dome light. It was a formal legal document stamped with the official seal of the City Housing Court. The bold black type at the top of the page read, "Final Notice of Eviction." I read through the details below. The document was addressed directly to Derek Ashford. It listed a small, deeply modest apartment in an undesirable neighborhood, miles removed from the affluent financial district he claimed to command. According to the court order, Derek was more than 6 months behind on his basic rent. The landlord had obtained a legal judgment against him, and city marshals were scheduled to forcibly clear out his belongings and lock him out of the property by next Tuesday. I settled back into the leather seat as the sheer scale of his deception rolled over me in a cold wave. Derek was not simply broke, he was entirely destitute. The self-proclaimed billionaire hedge fund manager, the man who had sneered at my boots, the man who boasted about acquiring skyscrapers in Charleston, was literally days away from having nowhere to sleep. The expensive suit was in all likelihood rented. The champagne was being charged to a fraudulent tab he had every intention of abandoning. And his entire survival, his desperate scheme to pay off violent creditors and stay off the streets, depended completely on tricking my daughter into signing a marriage certificate tomorrow afternoon. I folded the bright yellow eviction notice carefully and slid it alongside the rental agreement in my breast pocket. I switched off the dome, light climbed out of the rented Porsche Cayenne, and locked the door behind me. I returned to the valet podium, handed the key fob back to the young attendant, and gave him a quiet nod of thanks. The night air felt suddenly electric against my skin. The suffocating weight of uncertainty had lifted entirely, replaced by the cold, focused clarity of a father readying himself for absolute war. Tomorrow, the grand illusion would finally come apart in front of everyone, and I would be the one holding the hammer. I climbed the wide stone steps back toward the estate at an unhurried pace. The cold air had scrubbed my mind clean. Every footfall felt steady beneath me. Inside the main hall, the party had built to a fever pitch. The driving pulse of modern dance music pushed through the heavy wooden doors. I skirted the crowded ballroom entirely. I had no interest in watching a room full of oblivious socialites worship a false idol. Instead, I moved through a quiet, softly lit corridor toward the men's restroom. The heavy mahogany door was sitting slightly ajar. When I pushed it open, the bass from the music dropped away instantly, replaced by the harsh, echoing sound of ragged, panicked breathing. I stepped inside without a sound, letting the door ease shut at my back. The restroom was an ostentatious display of marble and polished brass, sharp with the smell of citrus hand soap and Derek Ashford's overpowering designer cologne. Derek stood alone at the far end of the long vanity counter. His tuxedo jacket had been stripped off and dropped carelessly onto the spotless floor. His silk tie was yanked open and hung crookedly around his neck. He was bent hard over the marble sink, gripping the brass edges so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He twisted the golden faucet on full and threw handfuls of ice-cold water across his face. He gasped at the shock of it, shoulders heaving as he fought to drag air into his terrified lungs. He was deep inside a full panic attack. The carefully assembled armor of the untouchable billionaire had dissolved, leaving nothing behind but a cornered animal. I stayed near the entrance, watching him with the detached calm of a man taking inventory. He muttered broken, desperate curses at his dripping reflection in the wide vanity mirror. For a long moment, Derek had no idea I was there. He kept hyperventilating, throwing cold water at his pale face, trying to shock his body back under control. As he raised his head to reach for a hand towel, his wild eyes swept the mirror and found my reflection standing directly behind him. The shift was instantaneous and pitiful. The raw terror drained from his face in a single heartbeat, swapped out for a manufactured surge of rage. It was the aggressive bluster of a weak man who knows he has just been caught. He wheeled around, water dripping from his chin and soaking into the collar of his dress shirt. His chest swelled, eyes narrowing to a vicious glare. He came at me in 2 quick steps, his dress shoes sliding slightly on the wet marble floor. Though, what are you doing sneaking around in here, you creepy old mechanic? Derek spat, his voice unsteady. Are you stalking me now? I kept my hands easy at my sides, my posture loose. I am simply using the restroom. Derek, I said evenly, my voice carrying no emotion at all. You look like you are struggling. Do you need me to call a doctor for you? That simple factual observation snapped whatever thin restraint he had left. The humiliation of being seen this way, undone, sweating, shaking by a man he considered beneath contempt, pushed him past the edge. Derek surged forward on a burst of unearned arrogance. He seized the lapels of my suit with his wet hands and drove me backward. My lower back caught the edge of the marble vanity with a dull thud. I did not flinch. I did not lift my hands. I stood there like a wall of stone, unmoved by the desperate force of a frightened boy. Derek shoved his face in close to mine. He smelled of expensive whiskey, stale fear, and nervous sweat. Listen to me very closely, you pathetic old man. Derek hissed spit, catching the light as he strained to project authority. I have been generous letting you sit in that dining hall tonight. I have tolerated your miserable presence because Sloane begged me to be a nice guy. But this is my world. You do not belong here. You are nothing but a dirty mechanic who failed his family. I want you to stay out of my way tomorrow. You sit in the back row, you keep your mouth shut. And you do not embarrass my beautiful bride with your disgusting poverty. If you ruin my perfect wedding, I will personally destroy what little life you have left. Do you understand me? He shoved me hard against the marble sink one final time, for emphasis, then released my lapels abruptly and stepped back as though contact with my suit had left something on his hands. He stood there panting, watching for me to cower, to apologize, to give him the submissive fear he so desperately needed. I gave him none of it. I simply looked at him, my face entirely blank. I raised one hand slowly and straightened the collar of my jacket, smoothing away the creases his wet fingers had pressed into it. The silence in that restroom stretched long and suffocating. My complete refusal to be rattled frightened him far more than any punch could have. A predator knows a lesser animal on sight, and Derek understood somewhere in the hollow center of himself that his performance had fallen completely flat. He swallowed hard, his throat visibly working. Without waiting for a word from me, Derek spun around and snatched his tuxedo jacket up off the wet floor. He reached blindly into his back pocket for his thick leather wallet, attempting to ram some loose cash inside in a manic rush. His hands were shaking too badly to manage even that. As he jammed the wallet back toward the pocket of his tailored trousers, he missed the opening entirely. The wallet snagged on the edge of the fabric and flipped awkwardly out of his clumsy grip. He cursed under his breath, snatched it back, and forced it deep into his pocket on the second attempt. He turned sharply and stormed out, slamming the heavy mahogany door behind him with everything he had. The crack of it echoed and then faded, leaving the lavish restroom wrapped in complete silence once again. I stood at the marble vanity and let the quiet settle around me. My eyes dropped to the exact spot where Derek had fumbled frantically with his leather wallet just moments before. Resting silently against the intricate geometric tile was a very small rectangular slip of bright pink paper. It had drifted unnoticed from his overstuffed wallet during his panicked exit. I stepped forward and crouched slowly, pinching the small slip between my calloused fingers. The heavy cardstock had a texture I recognized immediately. This was no restaurant receipt or business card. It was an official pawnshop transaction ticket. I turned it over and read the faded black ink printed across the front. The ticket documented the recent sale of a vintage, highly recognizable diamond necklace pawned for a fraction of its true worth, just to scrape together enough cash to fund a cubic zirconia ring. It was the final piece of physical evidence. I held the small pink slip up beneath the harsh, fluorescent light of the vanity mirror. My calloused thumb moved across the faded ink as my mind worked to absorb the devastating information pressed into that heavy cardstock. It was an official transaction record from a notoriously discreet pawnbroker operating deep inside Jewelers Row. The date stamped in the top right corner was exactly 3 months ago. That was the precise week Derek had formally asked for my daughter's hand in marriage. I studied the item description, feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The receipt did not list some generic piece of jewelry. It explicitly described the exact cut, clarity, and weight of a flawless 3-carat diamond. My breathing slowed as the devastating truth locked into place. Derek had not commissioned a custom ring to lavish my daughter with luxury. He had taken the antique family heirloom that Sloane's late grandmother had entrusted to him for the proposal. He had ruthlessly pried the priceless, flawless generational diamond from its antique platinum setting. He sold her family's legacy for quick cash to salvage his own truly miserable existence. Then, to cover his tracks, he had a cheap cubic zirconia mounted back into her grandmother's original setting. He presented it to Sloane as a magnificent custom upgrade, preying entirely on her manufactured hunger for high society validation. She wore the fake stone with pride, completely unaware that the real diamond, the very emblem of her family's history, had been handed off to a stranger. I read the final payout figure printed at the bottom of the pink slip. It was a substantial sum of liquid cash, more than enough to cover large, urgent personal debts without hesitation. My mind immediately connected the specific date on the pawn receipt to another critical point in the timeline. 3 months ago was the same week Renata had proudly announced that Derek had secured this magnificent coastal estate for the wedding weekend. She had boasted to anyone who would stand still long enough about how Derek had generously paid the astronomical venue deposit entirely upfront in cash. The puzzle was now fully assembled. He had not drawn on hedge fund profits to bankroll this lavish rehearsal dinner. He had used the stolen proceeds from Sloane's own family inheritance to temporarily prop up his pathetic grand illusion. Sloane was standing at the edge of an absolute disaster, joyfully preparing to marry a deeply dangerous and utterly desperate fraud. The man she believed to be a billionaire was in reality a penniless con artist, fleeing violent creditors. He was using her as a lifeline, planning to drain her grandfather's trust fund the instant the wedding was legally finalized tomorrow. I folded the pink slip precisely in half and slid it securely into my breast pocket alongside the rental agreement and the eviction notice. I now held the complete, irrefutable blueprint of his deception. The urge to march straight onto that dance floor and drag him off by his rented lapels surged hot through my veins. Every paternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to grab my daughter, hold up the pink slip in front of the entire crowd, and tear his fake kingdom down right then and there. But I forced my racing pulse to slow. I closed my eyes and drew a long, steadying breath in the quiet of that restroom. Acting on raw emotion is how impulsive men lose wars. A true apex predator understands the absolute importance of timing leverage and overwhelming force. If I walked out there now and told Sloane the truth, she would never believe a word of it. Renata's toxic materialism had worked on her for years. To Sloane, I was nothing more than the poor, bitter father from the trailer park, desperately trying to sabotage her glorious climb into high society. She would glance at the pawn receipt, and Derek would effortlessly spin another smooth, plausible story. He would call it a complex investment strategy or a short-term business arrangement, and she would swallow every syllable to protect the fantasy she had built. A single piece of paper was not enough to break the deep spell he had cast over her. I needed to back him into a public corner so tight that no amount of silver-tongued talking could pull him free. I needed to let him construct his glorious pedestal as high as it would go, so the fall would shatter him permanently. The tension in my jaw eased as the strategy sharpened into clarity. I could not fight this battle in the costume of a forgotten mechanic. I needed to bring the full, terrifying weight of my actual financial empire down on him. I walked out of the restroom and moved straight through the laughing, glittering crowd of wealthy guests without a word to anyone. I did not pause to look at Sloane still spinning blissfully on the marble dance floor in the arms of a complete fraud. I did not acknowledge Renata, who was thrusting her empty champagne flute at a passing waiter. I pushed open the heavy front doors and walked out into the cool dark. I approached the valet, asked for my old battered pickup, and stood in the damp coastal breeze while I waited. When the young attendant brought the truck around, he gave me that familiar, slightly sympathetic look, having no idea he was handing the keys to a man who could purchase this entire estate with a single phone call. I climbed into the worn driver's seat, turned the ignition, and let the steady, familiar rumble of the engine settle over me. I pulled out slowly through the circular gravel drive, leaving the bright, hollow mansion behind me. The ride back to my modest rented motel room at the edge of town was silent, deliberate, and entirely focused. Once inside the quiet room, I retrieved my encrypted satellite phone from my duffel bag. This was the line I reserved strictly for coordinating high-level global logistics and major corporate acquisitions. I dialed the private number of my chief legal counsel, a brilliant and absolutely ruthless attorney named Nolan. He picked up on the second ring, long accustomed to receiving operational directives from me at late hours. I instructed him to immediately acquire the entire commercial debt portfolio of Derek Ashford. Every loan, every outstanding marker, every legal obligation Derek had ever put his name to, I wanted it all transferred into my name. Nolan asked no unnecessary questions. He simply confirmed that my directive would be executed without fault before the sun rose over the eastern seaboard. I ended the call and set the phone on the bedside table. I reached into my pocket and withdrew the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, and the eviction notice. I arranged all three side by side on the cheap mattress. Tomorrow, Sloan would walk down the aisle expecting a fairy tale. What I was going to deliver instead was a devastating, unstoppable wave of absolute, undeniable truth. Derek Ashford was about to lose everything. The motel walls were paper thin, trembling faintly with the heavy sound of a passing semi-truck on the nearby highway. I stared at the three documents spread across the faded bedspread: the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, the eviction notice. Nolan was already moving through legitimate financial channels, acquiring whatever commercial debt Derek had recklessly accumulated. But the desperate, panicked phone call I had overheard in the garden called for a completely different approach. Commercial banks do not dispatch men in cheap leather jackets to intimidate clients at wedding rehearsals. That kind of raw, threatening pressure belonged to the violent shadow economy. I needed airtight security for what came next. I picked up my keys, stepped out of the dim room, and walked to my battered 2003 Chevy Silverado, sitting beneath a flickering amber street lamp. The coastal air was dense with salt and rolling fog. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the heavy doors firmly behind me, sealing myself inside the insulated quiet of the cab. I reached beneath the worn floor mat and released a hidden reinforced steel compartment. I pulled out my primary encrypted satellite phone. This device was completely untraceable, entirely off the public grid, and reserved exclusively for the most critical high-stakes operations of my global empire. I dialed a specific heavily encrypted international number. The secure line clicked and connected almost instantly. This time, I was not calling Nolan. I was calling Stellan. Stellan was the ruthlessly efficient lead counsel and chief security fixer for the darkest, most aggressive arms of Wynn Enterprises. He did not handle corporate mergers or public relations. He dealt with the brutal mechanics of international leverage. Stellan answered, his voice a low, measured gravel that commanded immediate respect. "Stellan," I said, keeping my tone perfectly calibrated and dangerously quiet. "I need you to run a level 1 background check on a man named Derek Ashford, but stay completely clear of his public financial records. Go directly into the underground lenders operating across the tri-state area. Consider it done," Stellan replied without hesitation. "What exactly are we hunting tonight?" "Someone in the shadow market is sitting on a specific, highly volatile $4 million marker against him," I told him. "It falls due by Monday morning, and they are already dispatching physical collectors to intimidate him at public events. I want that debt, Stellan. Locate the exact criminal syndicate holding his paper, then acquire it entirely through our untraceable dummy corporations. Whatever the cartel or the loan sharks want for that NIS marker, double it immediately in untraceable offshore funds. By sunrise tomorrow, I want to be the sole absolute owner of Derek Ashford's entire life." "I will make the right connections right now," Stellan said without a trace of hesitation. "I will have full legal ownership transferred to your primary blind trust before the traditional banks even open their doors." I ended the call and rested the heavy satellite phone on the empty passenger seat. I leaned my head back against the worn fabric of the headrest and stared out through the fogged windshield. The flickering street lamp stretched long, distorted shadows across the empty lot. My mind worked like a calculating machine, processing the sheer magnitude of the trap I had just set. For decades, Renata had relentlessly poisoned my daughter's thinking with the toxic conviction that real power was measured entirely in loud, ostentatious displays of wealth. She had raised Sloan to worship the gleaming hollow shell of a man like Derek, while holding in contempt the quiet, grinding labor that actually built the world. Derek was the ultimate product of that shallow, grasping philosophy. He had spent his entire adult life assembling expensive props. A fake diamond, a rented sports car, a fabricated hedge fund, all of it meticulously staged to project an image of unquestionable dominance. But there was no foundation beneath any of it. He was a hollow statue erected on rapidly crumbling sand. Real power does not brag at a dinner party. Real power does not publicly humiliate a working man just to feel significant. Real power is sitting in silence in a battered pickup in a deserted motel parking lot at 3:30 in the morning, making a single untraceable phone call that purchases a desperate man's life, his freedom, and every last inch of his future. I closed my eyes and let the steady rhythm of my breathing cool my racing mind. The paternal fury was still alive inside me, burning like a furnace deep in my chest, but it was entirely controlled. I was not moving out of petty vengeance. I was executing a precise surgical operation to save my only daughter from a lifetime of absolute ruin. She would almost certainly hate me for dismantling her perfect fairy tale. She would scream, she would weep, and she would likely try to cut me out of her life entirely. But a good father does not shield his child to win her immediate approval. He protects her because it is his most fundamental sacred obligation, regardless of the personal cost. The hours dragged by in the cold, silent cab. I watched the thick coastal fog begin to thin as the first pale gray light of a new dawn seeped into the eastern sky. My encrypted satellite phone suddenly vibrated against the passenger seat, shattering the heavy quiet of the morning. I snatched it up and answered immediately. "It is officially done," Stellan reported, his voice crisp and clinical. The underground syndicate holding the $4 million marker was surprisingly eager to unload the problematic debt. They knew Ashford was a massive, unpredictable flight risk. We transferred exactly $8 million through the secondary offshore shell corporation. The official digital marker and all the damaging physical blackmail material they held against him are now legally and permanently in your exclusive possession. Did they ask any questions about the buyer? I pressed, watching the brightening sunrise wash slowly over the hood of my old truck. None at all, Stellan replied evenly. They were simply delighted to double their risky criminal investment overnight. Derek Ashford now owes you exactly $4 million payable immediately upon your direct demand. You have complete total financial leverage. Thank you, Stellan, I said quietly. Stand by for further instructions this afternoon. I ended the call and returned the phone to the hidden floor compartment. The leverage I needed was now fully secured. I stepped out of the truck and walked back into my small motel room. I had a wedding to prepare for. I laid out my clean, well-pressed navy suit from JCPenney that I had bought 15 years ago. I polished my old steel-toed work boots until they held a dull gleam. I gathered the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, the eviction notice, and the digital confirmation of his criminal debt. I folded them with care and set them aside. The morning sun pushed through the coastal fog, casting pale light through the thin curtains of my motel room. I stood at the cracked mirror and buttoned my navy suit. The fabric was stiff against my skin, a deliberate contrast to the custom Italian wool I wore in my real life. I pulled on my polished steel-toed work boots. Then I took the folded stack of evidence, the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, the eviction notice, and the digital confirmation of Derek Ashford's criminal debt, and secured them inside my breast pocket. They sat against my chest like a loaded weapon. I drove toward the coastal estate. The grounds were already churning with frantic energy when I arrived. Florists were rushing to arrange towering walls of white roses. Caterers were calling sharp instructions as they raised the outdoor dining tents. I parked near the service entrance and kept myself entirely out of view. I needed to stay invisible until the moment was exactly right. I had not been standing by the doors 10 minutes when Renata spotted me. She was cutting across the lawn with an expensive clipboard under her arm, barking orders into a silver earpiece. Her face held the tight, brittle look of a woman, straining to project flawless control. The moment her eyes found me, that frantic energy sharpened into something focused and vicious. She ended her call and came straight at me. "Garrett, you are completely useless standing around here like a lost vagrant." She snapped, her voice thick with contempt. The main delivery truck just pulled up at the back gate with the bulk ice for the outdoor reception bars. The catering company is trying to tack on an extra $200 just to unload it. We absolutely cannot throw money away on basic labor when we are already paying a fortune for this venue. Get yourself down to the loading dock and unload those 50 bags of ice. Try to make yourself at least somewhat useful for once in your life. I looked at her face. A man who controls global shipping routes does not unload delivery trucks to save $200. But a man building an inescapable trap plays his assigned role without complaint. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I lowered my head, gave a submissive nod, and walked toward the gravel loading dock at the rear of the estate. I needed Renata and Derek to feel completely secure, utterly convinced that their cruelty over me was absolute. The refrigerated delivery truck sat idling near the back gate, its rear doors thrown open to reveal massive pallets stacked with bags of commercial ice. Each bag weighed 40 pounds. I rolled the sleeves of my suit jacket up over my weathered forearms. I reached into the freezing truck bed, gripped the first bag, and swung it up onto my right shoulder. The cold soaked straight through the thin fabric and into my bones. I turned and began the long walk across the property toward the main reception tents. My 70-year-old muscles strained under the shifting weight. I focused on my breathing, settling into the steady rhythm of hard physical labor I had first learned decades ago on the freezing docks of Charleston Harbor. As I hauled the fourth bag of ice across the courtyard, a sharp burst of arrogant laughter rang out from the stone patio above me. What you are about to witness is the moment everything Garrett had quietly built in the dark is finally brought into the light, and the cost for the man who underestimated him will be total. Before we get there, tell me if someone close to you had been working against you the whole time. Would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you wait and let the truth do its own damage? Derek Ashford had emerged from the main house, surrounded by a tight cluster of 5 groomsmen. They wore matching custom-tailored suits and cradled crystal glasses filled with morning mimosas. From their elevated balcony, they looked down at me, the way ancient kings regard a laboring peasant. Derek leveled a manicured finger in my direction, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his freshly shaved face. "Look at this pathetic display, boys," Derek called out, making sure his voice carried all the way down to me. He leaned over the ornate stone railing and shook his head in theatrical pity. "I told you we had our very own personal pack mule for the weekend." The groomsmen erupted into contemptuous laughter. One of them, a tall man with slicked-back hair, raised his glass in a mocking toast. Keep moving, old man," he bellowed down at me. "That expensive champagne is not going to chill itself. You better pick up the pace before you break a hip." I did not break my stride. I did not glance up at the balcony. I kept my head down, playing the role of the broken, humiliated father with absolute precision. I let the freezing meltwater run down my neck and soak into my collar. I hauled the 5th bag, then the 10th, then the 20th. My shoulders burned and my calloused hands went numb against the biting cold. The physical punishment was real, but it was nothing against the blazing razor-sharp focus locked inside my mind. Every time those arrogant men laughed, every time Derek hurled another degrading insult down from his comfortable perch, I felt a distinct silent vibration deep in my trouser pocket. My encrypted satellite phone was buzzing steadily against my leg. Stellan was feeding me automated real-time tactical updates from the Wynn Enterprises war room. Each silent vibration was a massive lethal strike against Derek's counterfeit empire, Buzz. Our dummy corporations had formally executed the full transfer of his $4 million criminal debt. Buzz. The underground syndicate had officially cleared the offshore payment, washing their hands of Derek Ashford completely and permanently. Buzz. Our legal team had successfully frozen all 3 of his primary bank accounts using the newly acquired leverage. Buzz. We had flagged his fraudulent hedge fund operations directly to the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. The trap was not merely closing, it was snapping shut with bone-crushing inescapable force. I swung the 30th bag of ice onto my aching shoulder. I moved past the rose gardens, listening to the groomsmen keep up their relentless mockery. They had absolutely no idea they were ridiculing the apex predator, who now held title to every breath Derek Ashford drew. I carried the 40th bag. Renata swept past me and offered a smug, satisfied smirk at the dark sweat stains spreading across my old suit. I lifted the 50th and final bag. As I hoisted that last load, my phone delivered one final buzz, long and sustained. The confirmation. Stellan had secured the ultimate kill switch. I carried the last bag to the outdoor bar and dropped it with a heavy thud into the stainless steel cooler. I straightened up slowly, working the stiffness out of my back. The labor was done. The demeaning performance was finished. I smoothed my damp sleeves down and buttoned my jacket. The sun was fully overhead now, flooding the vast estate in bright morning light. The wedding ceremony was less than 3 hours away. I looked up toward the stone balcony. Derek was still there, smiling, broadly, utterly oblivious to the fact that he was already a dead man walking. I turned and moved toward the guest seating area, completely ready to watch the entire world burn. The sprawling coastal estate had transformed into a breathtaking spectacle of high society excess. Massive floral arches of pristine white roses and imported orchids framed the central aisle. A jazz trio was already warming up in the shade of a towering oak, drifting soft, elegant notes across the morning air. Wealthy guests were arriving in waves draped in designer gowns and finely tailored suits. They drifted across the manicured lawn, sipping flutes of sparkling water and admiring the sweeping ocean view beyond. I stood near the back row of the seating arrangement, blending effortlessly into the background in my cheap, damp suit. Renata moved through the crowd like a frantic general directing an army. She greeted each elite guest with her rehearsed synthetic smile, making certain everyone appreciated the scale of the luxury she claimed to have orchestrated. I caught a brief glimpse of my daughter Sloane as she appeared on the upper balcony of the main house, surrounded by a flurry of bridesmaids and makeup artists. Even from that distance, the radiant, genuine happiness on her face was impossible to miss. She gazed down at the assembling crowd, completely swept up in the magnificent fairy tale taking shape around her. It tore at something deep inside me to see her so completely deceived. She truly believed she was about to marry a successful, generous man who would protect and love her for the rest of her life. She had no idea she was willingly walking into a devastating trap laid by a ruthless predator. I checked the heavy silver watch on my wrist. Exactly 30 minutes remained before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The air hummed with joyful anticipation, but my attention was locked entirely on the tactical timeline Stellan had established. I slipped quietly away from the swelling crowd, easing past the usher station and down a narrow cobblestone path that hugged the outer edge of the estate. It wound around the back of the catering tents and ended in a secluded, shaded passage behind the main service kitchen. The crashing noise of industrial cookware and the barked commands of the catering staff fell away as I stepped into the deep shadow of the brick passage. It was a dark, quiet pocket of space hidden entirely from the glittering perfection of the wedding grounds. I stood motionless, waiting in the damp coastal air. Exactly 1 minute later, a sleek black sedan rolled silently to the edge of the service gate. A man climbed out. He did not carry himself like any delivery driver. He wore a sharp dark suit with dark glasses and an earpiece. He moved with the efficient, measured precision of a seasoned corporate security operative. He picked me out of the shadows without hesitation and came directly toward me. He stopped exactly 3 feet away and reached inside his tailored jacket. He said nothing at all. He simply extended his hand and offered me a thick, heavy black leather folder. The smooth leather was stamped with a small, discreet silver crest, the mark of Wynn Enterprises. I reached out and took it from his grip. The operative gave a single respectful nod, turned sharply on his heel, and walked back to the waiting sedan. The car reversed smoothly through the service entrance and disappeared down the coastal road, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet passage. I pressed my back against the cold brick wall of the kitchen and drew a slow, measured breath. I broke the wax seal and opened the folder. The dense stack of documents inside represented everything that Stellan's overnight operation had uncovered. I expected the standard predatory loan agreements, the punishing interest rates, the explicit threats of violence that shadow market debt always carries. But as I worked past the initial financial summaries and into the core contractual language, my blood went cold. The true scope of this deception was infinitely worse than anything I had anticipated. Derek Ashford had not simply borrowed $4 million to sustain his hollow illusion of wealth. He had not merely signed his own name to a dangerous marker with a violent cartel. He had deliberately and maliciously committed high-level identity theft. I stared at the bold black type running across the central collateral agreement. There, in stark and undeniable print, was her full legal name. Directly beneath it sat her exact, highly confidential social security number, alongside the sensitive routing details for her generational marital trust fund. Derek had painstakingly forged her signature across the criminal syndicate's primary collateral documents. He had deliberately used my innocent daughter as the sole financial guarantor for his massive illegal debt. If Derek defaulted on that $4 million payment, the violent syndicate was not going after him. Those forged documents gave them full legal authority to drain that trust fund down to the last cent. He had offered her up as a sacrificial lamb to buy his own survival. The sheer sociopathic calculation of it was staggering. He had spent 2 years flooding her with manufactured affection, fake diamonds, and rented cars, all to gain enough access to her private financial records to execute this devastating theft. A cold, absolute fury settled into my bones like iron. The time for watching and waiting was completely over. I drew my encrypted satellite phone from my pocket and dialed the private number. He answered immediately. "Stellan," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, hollow register. The black folder was in my possession. I had read every word of the collateral agreement. He had forged her signature, used her entire identity to back the marker. I witnessed it as well. Sir Stellan replied, his voice perfectly even. "The brazenness of this fraud is genuinely remarkable. Our digital trail is airtight. It shows he broke into her private financial records a full 3 days before he pulled off the illegal loan. Every exit is sealed. Move on the purchase now." I barked the order while my eyes swept the crowded courtyard beyond the mouth of the alley. "Pull every available offshore dollar and wire it immediately. The price is irrelevant. Acquire the debt. Get it done. I need ironclad, unchallengeable control of this whole situation." "The wire is already moving," Sir Stellan said. "The cartel has surrendered every claim. Derek Ashford's debts, his fraudulent paper, his entire financial future, all of it now belongs to you alone. The man is yours." I killed the call and tucked the phone away. That folder sat in my grip like something loaded and primed. The long, crooked con Derek had been running was finally careening toward its reckoning. I came out of the shadows of the alley and stepped back into the afternoon light. It was time. Sloane's wedding was waiting, and I had a seat to fill. The coastal ceremony that followed was something out of a stage production, immaculate, precisely choreographed, not a single detail left to chance. I took a chair in the very last row among the rows of pristine white seats, and I watched my daughter give her life to a man who had been engineering her ruin from the start. Sloane was stunning in her gown, her whole face bright with a joy she'd earned honestly. Derek inhabited the role of the adoring billionaire groom without a single crack showing. He held her hands as though they were made of glass, pressed a solitary rehearsed tear from the corner of his eye, and pledged to shelter and provide for her until the end of his days. The moneyed guests up front breathed soft sighs of approval, every last one of them swallowed whole by the spectacle. I kept my eyes dry. I sat in my back row chair with that heavy black leather folder pressed flat against my chest and said nothing. Once the vows were done, the crowd drifted into the climate-controlled reception tents, and the wealth on display was enough to make your stomach turn with its excess. Massive crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, suspended from billowing draped fabric, throwing gold light across table settings that probably cost more than my truck. Tuxedoed waiters never stopped moving, ferrying silver platters of top-shelf champagne and food I couldn't name. My assigned place was a small, shadowy table, shoved into the farthest back corner of the tent, wedged right against the kitchen's swinging service doors. Renata had arranged that. Deliberately, she wanted me where none of her friends would have to look at me. What she'd actually handed me was a ringside seat to the wreckage ahead. As the lavish hours wore on, Derek began coming apart at the seams, undone by the sheer intoxication of believing he'd already won. Glass after glass of the finest vintage in the house disappeared down his throat, his certainty growing that every fraudulent thread he'd woven was now safely knotted. He swaggered across the dance floor with his groomsmen, pounding backs and bellowing jokes that weren't funny. He was convinced the ultimate score was his. He had the $4 million lined up to pay off the criminal syndicate breathing down his neck. He had a wealthy, beautiful wife, and through her, he now had a clear legal road into a fortune built across generations. Nothing could touch him. When the silverware began chiming against crystal, marking the toast portion of the evening, Derek snatched the wireless microphone from the bandleader's hands and cut a confident path to the dead center of the marble floor. His speech started smooth, practiced warmth, self-deprecating little stories, the kind of charm that looks effortless and costs nothing. He heaped praise on Renata for her refinement and her tireless backing, not once letting on that his lifestyle was entirely built on money he'd stolen from someone else. Then he faced Sloane and poured out a treacly speech about how completely she had taken over his heart. Warm applause rolled through the tent, but it wasn't enough for Derek. He was soaked in expensive alcohol, his ego swelling past any reasonable ceiling. He craved something more than clapping. He needed to plant his flag to make the room feel the full weight of who he was. The applause ebbed, and those sharp predatory eyes began sweeping the tent. I already knew what he was hunting. His gaze traveled the well-lit tables near the stage, then knifed back through the dark perimeter and settled on me alone in my corner. Whatever warmth had been on his face evaporated on contact. What replaced it was something uglier, a slow, contemptuous curl of the lip. The microphone shifted in his tightening fist. He had made a decision the evening wouldn't feel finished until he'd ground me into the floor in front of everyone. Derek half turned and waved the catering crew forward with the cake. A towering 5-tier masterpiece covered in silvered leaf and delicate spun sugar flowers glided out onto the dance floor on a rolling cart. The crowd murmured appreciatively. He lifted the ornate silver cake knife from the display. He never once looked for Sloane to join him in cutting it. What he did instead was hack off an enormous wedge of the vanilla cake and muscle it onto a small porcelain plate. He gave the knife back to a waiter who looked like he wasn't sure what was happening. Plate balanced in his right hand, microphone gripped in his left. Derek set his jaw and started walking past the elegant tables, straight across the length of the ballroom, heading directly for my dark corner. The noise in the tent died to nothing. Guests swiveled in their seats with uneasy looks tracking the groom as he pushed past them like they weren't there. His expensive shoes struck the wooden floor with a faint rhythmic echo. Sloane had gone perfectly still near the center of the room, the happiness draining from her face as she watched her husband cut through the crowd toward the back. Renata observed it all from where she stood, a cold, creeping smile already forming. She knew exactly what was coming and liked it. Derek drew up at my table. He planted himself close enough that I could see the fury working in his chest, his breathing slightly ragged, his eyes alight with something close to hatred. I stayed in my seat. I held his gaze without blinking. My hands were open and quiet in my lap, and I gave him nothing, no tension, no reaction, just absolute stillness. Derek lifted the microphone and let the speakers carry his voice to every corner of the tent. "You know tonight has been a remarkable blessing," Derek said, each word lacquered with poisonous sarcasm. "I look around this room and I see power achievement people who genuinely matter, but we have an obligation to acknowledge those less fortunate among us. True character demands we offer something to the ones who never found their footing in this world." I never even saw it coming in time to react. Derek dropped the microphone onto the table, seized that enormous frosting-laden slab of cake with his bare hand, and drove it straight into my face with everything he had. Vanilla cake and thick buttercream collapsed against my nose and cheekbones, the impact blinding me instantly, the mess sliding in heavy streaks down the front of my jacket. "Enjoy your dessert, beggar," Derek bellowed, his voice stripped raw with ugly crowing cruelty. "Nobody's going to accuse me of letting my pathetic father-in-law go hungry at my own wedding." The act detonated something in the room, a charge of pure shock that rolled through every table. For one long suspended moment, silence owned the tent completely. Then Derek's groomsmen blew it apart with the kind of laughter that is meant to wound. It moved through the crowd like a contagion. Renata, standing up near the front, let the smirk on her face open into full, ugly satisfaction. My daughter made no sound at all. Sloane stood with both hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. I sat without moving, dragging the frosting clear of my eyes one slow stroke at a time. Cold cream ran down onto my collar and soaked into the fabric of my shirt. I let it. My eyes stayed locked on his. I had nothing to say, only the silence of a man who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. The ruined cake continued sliding down my cheek and dropped with a quiet, soft sound onto the white tablecloth below. Sugar stuck to my lashes. The weight of the frosting pulled at my collar. I kept my hands in my lap. What I projected from that chair was something that had nothing to do with weakness. It was the stillness of controlled certainty, and it seemed to pull the air right out of the tent around us. Derek towered over me with his chest out, riding the high of his groomsmen's laughter like a man who believes he has just conquered something. He spread both arms wide and turned to milk the cruelty from his audience. Renata rested back against the table nearby, pleasure glittering in her eyes as she watched the working-class mechanic receive what she believed was his proper station. My daughter hadn't moved from the dance floor. Sloane looked like the earth had dropped away under her, like gravity itself had stopped making sense. The man she had just married had revealed something monstrous in the span of 30 seconds. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Derek turned his back to me, and lifted both hands, milking the room for another wave of applause to feed his pathetic ego. That was the moment a chair scraped violently against the marble floor, the sound booming through the hushed tent like something struck with a hammer. The sharp crack sliced through the dying laughter and stopped it cold. From a premium VIP table positioned close to the stage, a large figure rose to his feet. It was Conrad Harwick. Conrad was the genuine article, a ruthless, legitimately powerful billionaire who had built one of the most formidable real estate empires on the entire eastern seaboard. Derek had clearly placed him at this wedding as a kind of trophy, a calculated move to borrow credibility from a real titan of industry. Conrad did not look like a man enjoying the show. His face had gone a deep, furious crimson. He threw his linen napkin across his plate and came straight across the polished dance floor toward us. The man's physical presence alone commanded the room without a word. He was large, deliberate, and wholly intolerant of foolishness. Whatever murmuring still lingered in the crowd went completely silent. The wedding band read the shift in atmosphere and stopped playing mid-phrase. The quiet that settled over the reception tent had weight to it, the kind that presses down on your chest. Derek swung around, a smile stuck to his face, slightly puzzled but still confident as he watched the billionaire close in. He clearly assumed Conrad was crossing the room to applaud him, maybe even join in the joke at the poor bride's father's expense. Derek actually stepped toward him, extending his hand in a bid for wealthy solidarity. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Conrad thundered, brushing Derek's outstretched hand aside the way you'd swat away something unpleasant. The volume of it rattled the crystal chandeliers overhead. His eyes burned with a combination of deep shock and barely leashed fury. One thick, trembling finger leveled itself at Derek's chest. "Do you have a literal death wish, you stupid, arrogant child?" Derek flinched hard, that easy smile fracturing apart. Being verbally demolished by a man he practically worshipped seemed to physically knock the air from him. "Conrad, I don't understand." Derek's voice dropped 2 full octaves into something thin and unsteady. "It was just a harmless joke. He is just a mechanic." A mechanic. Conrad let the words sit there, his voice loaded with venomous disbelief. He advanced another step, driving Derek backward into the edge of my small table. "You are without question the most pathetic, oblivious fraud I have ever had the misfortune of sitting across a dinner table from. That man seated right there is Garrett Wynn. He owns the commercial shipping ports you claim to run your imports through. He controls the global logistics empire that moves half the freight along this entire coastline. And that major commercial high-rise in Charleston that you spent the whole cocktail hour boasting about acquiring, he is the man who purchased it outright in cash yesterday morning." The collective gasp that tore through the reception tent was almost deafening. 200 wealthy socialites, investors, and family members drew breath at the exact same moment in raw, uncut shock. Those words hung in the air like smoke, incinerating every fabrication Derek Ashford had ever constructed. The revelation hit the room like a demolition charge. Renata lost her grip on her crystal champagne flute. It struck the marble floor and burst apart, but she didn't so much as glance at the wreckage. Her jaw had gone slack, her face draining to a sickly, washed-out gray, her frantic eyes jumping between Conrad and me. I kept my hands resting quietly on the table. I reached for a folded white linen napkin. With movements that were unhurried and steady, I began clearing the sticky vanilla frosting from my face, my eyes, my cheeks, my chin, letting the full, crushing weight of Conrad Harwick's words settle over the room and slowly suffocate the groom. Derek looked like something vital had been torn out of him. Every drop of color had left his face, giving him the hollow look of a man already gone. His arrogant posture collapsed inward. His breathing came in short, shallow pulls. The man who had just driven a fistful of wedding cake into my face was unraveling completely right there in front of 200 people. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. The smug, untouchable hedge fund manager no longer existed. What stood in his place was a frightened young man who had just understood too late that he had thrown a punch at an apex predator while mistaking it for something harmless. He stared at the worn suit I was dressed in, and the depth of the deception finally registered behind his eyes. I had not walked into this wedding as a broken, outmatched mechanic. I had arrived in the costume of prey to walk him straight into a cage. He had no idea he was entering, and he had stepped inside it willingly, practically slamming the heavy steel door himself. Sloane moved forward on unsteady legs, her expression caught between confusion and dawning dread. "Dad," she whispered, and even in that quiet, the word carried clearly. "Is that true? Are you Garrett Wynn?" I set the stained linen napkin down on the table. I didn't look at my daughter yet. Every bit of my attention stayed fixed on the trembling, perspiring man directly in front of me. I pushed my chair back with a scrape of wood against the floorboards and came to my feet. Without the deliberate stoop I'd been carrying, my full bearing reasserted itself immediately. I straightened what remained of my ruined collar and looked down at Derek. "Conrad is entirely correct," I said very quietly. The calm, absolute authority behind those words seemed to make the silence in the room grow heavier still. Derek stumbled back a half step, his legs threatening to give beneath the crushing weight of everything collapsing around him. He opened his mouth, searching for some last lie to deploy, but there was nowhere left to retreat to. The extravagant, meticulously constructed illusion had finally come apart completely. I moved away from the small table, with measured ease, leaving the ruined cake, where it lay ready to deliver the final blow. I held Derek's gaze without blinking, letting the weight of the tense silence amplify the terror visibly radiating off him. He had expected me to shrink to slink back into the shadows, with frosting still dripping from my collar. Instead, I reached for a fresh linen napkin from the table's edge. With slow, deliberate, rock-steady hands, I removed the last of the vanilla cake from my face. I dropped the soiled napkin at his feet, letting it land on the floor beside his expensive shoes. The whispers among the guests had gone completely silent. Conrad Harwick stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching everything unfold with grim, controlled satisfaction. Renata looked as though the floor might give out beneath her one manicured hand, clamped to the back of a chair for support. I closed the distance between myself and the man who had believed he'd brought my family to its knees. The illusion of the clueless, uneducated mechanic dissolved entirely. I stood at full height, shoulders squared, projecting the cold, disciplined authority of a man who runs an international empire. Derek stumbled back a clumsy half-step, his chest working hard, the full scope of his catastrophic miscalculation finally landing. I slid my hand inside the breast pocket of my damp, wrecked suit jacket. My fingers found the thick, heavy black leather folder that Stellan had placed in my hands in that alleyway just hours before. I drew it out slowly, letting the silver crest of Wynn Enterprises catch the warm blaze of the chandeliers above. Derek's eyes locked onto the folder, and a sickening recognition moved across his face. He understood precisely what kind of documentation required that level of corporate protection. Without breaking eye contact, I raised the folder and threw it squarely into his chest. The weight of it struck him hard at the sternum. He grabbed for it, but his hands were shaking too badly to hold on. The folder hit the marble floor and burst open on impact. A thick stack of confidential legal documents, bank records, and printed background checks fanned out across the polished surface in every direction. The undeniable, fully documented evidence of his fraudulent existence was now spread across the dance floor for the entire room to examine. "Your exclusive elite hedge fund is a complete phantom, Derek," I said, my voice carrying cleanly and firmly through the silence. "There are no Charleston acquisitions. There are no international corporate mergers. Your entire operation is nothing more than a legally registered limited liability company carrying exactly zero assets, zero legitimate clients, and absolutely no trading history. You have been surviving on a fabricated portfolio using counterfeit bank statements to seduce desperate investors and credulous socialites who were too dazzled by your rented suits to look past the surface and verify what you were actually worth." The guests near the front began exchanging urgent whispers. Several men, who had in all likelihood handed this man their own money, went visibly pale, phones already appearing in their hands. Derek's mouth fell open as he groped for some kind of defense, but his throat had gone bone dry. His eyes dropped to the scattered papers on the floor, and he understood with terrible clarity that every lie he had carefully layered over the past 5 years was now permanently on display for the world. I pulled my attention away from the trembling coward and turned it directly to my daughter. Sloane stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, tears gathering in her eyes. Both hands were still pressed tight over her mouth. "Sloane," I said, gentling my voice until it was meant only for her, "I need you to take that engagement ring off right now, sweetheart." Her trembling hands dropped from her face. She looked down at the large glittering stone on her finger. I pressed on, forcing the ugly truth all the way into the light. That stone is nothing but glass Sloane, a worthless piece of polished cubic zirconia. 3 months ago, the very same week he got down on one knee for you, the man standing before you walked into a shady pawnbroker on Jewelers Row. He took the priceless, flawless heirloom diamond that your late grandmother had trusted to his keeping, and he tore it ruthlessly from its antique platinum setting. He sold your family's legacy for a handful of desperate cash, just enough to cover the deposit on this very venue. Sloane let out a sharp, devastated gasp. She pulled the ring from her finger as though the metal had scalded her. She stared at the fake stone, the full weight of the betrayal breaking across her face. She lifted her eyes to Derek in silence, pleading with him to deny it, to tell her it was some terrible misunderstanding. But Derek couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. He stared at the floor, his jaw working soundlessly, confirming every word that had just come out of my mouth. Renata let out a loud, theatrical wail, the reality finally arriving that her grand social ascent had been built on cheap glass and stolen heirlooms. She crumpled into a nearby chair and buried her face in her hands. The entire room watched in absolute horror as the handsome, charming groom was taken apart, piece by piece, exposed as nothing more than a predatory fraud who had fed off the innocent trust of a young woman. I brought my focus back to Derek. The moment for the final blow had arrived. I took one slow, deliberate step into his space, forcing him to look up at me. He was completely cornered, pinned between my presence and the wall of furious guests pressing in around him. You didn't just pawn a ring to stay afloat, I said, my voice falling to a dangerously low, gravelly whisper that carried a lethal edge. You borrowed exactly $4 million from an extraordinarily violent syndicate with ties to the Russian mob. You were desperate and you were a coward. So rather than put your own name on the line, you committed malicious identity theft. You deliberately used my innocent daughter's highly confidential social security number as the primary collateral on your illegal marker. You legally authorized a cartel to strip her generational trust fund bare the moment you inevitably defaulted. Derek squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear of raw, undiluted fear worked its way down his pale cheek. His whole body was shaking. He knew precisely how the lenders he had borrowed from dealt with people who couldn't pay. But that desperate little scheme of yours dies tonight. I kept going, each word landing on him like something physical. As of 6 Stundoiler this morning, my global corporation moved aggressively into the shadow market. We acquired that entire debt portfolio through our untraceable shell companies. You don't owe the Russian mob a single penny anymore, Derek. You owe me. Your entire existence belongs to me now. I hold your $4 million marker outright, and I am calling it in this moment. You have exactly 10 seconds to absorb that reality before my security team removes you from this reception and hands you directly to the federal authorities for massive financial fraud and felony identity theft. Run if you want, flee like the miserable coward you actually are. Derek, get out of my sight and stay away from my family. Derek did not run. His legs simply gave out, unable to carry the crushing weight of his sudden total destruction. He went down onto the cold marble of the dance floor, his expensive tailored trousers bunching awkwardly around his knees. The arrogant, untouchable groom who had shoved cake into my face moments ago was completely gone. What remained was a broken, sniveling fraud. He crawled forward across the polished stone, closing the short distance between us. His hands, still tacky with the vanilla frosting he had used to humiliate me, reached out in desperation. He wrapped his fingers around the scuffed leather of my steel-toed work boots and clutched them like they were the only solid thing left in his world. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat of genuine panic. "Please, Mr. Wynn." Derek begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine that carried through every corner of the silent tent. "Please, I am begging you. I will do anything. I will work for you the rest of my life. I will be your absolute slave. Just please don't destroy me. Don't let them take me. I can fix this. I can make everything right." I looked down at the weeping man clinging to my worn boots. There was no pity anywhere in me, only a deep-settled disgust. This was the predator who had manipulated my daughter, sold her grandmother's irreplaceable heirloom, and casually pledged her financial future to a violent criminal organization just to bankroll his pathetic illusions of wealth and status. I drew my boot back slowly and deliberately, letting his grasping hands slide off the worn leather. I stepped away from him, placing a clean distance between my family and his poisonous wreckage. You cannot build something honest on a foundation made entirely of malicious lies. Derek, I said, my voice cold and stripped of every emotion. You made every one of these choices with absolute arrogance, utterly convinced you were the sharpest mind in any room you entered. Now, you will live with the full consequences of those choices. I raised my right hand. I didn't raise my voice. I simply snapped my fingers. The crisp, sharp sound broke through the heavy silence of the tent like a dry branch splitting. At once, the wide wooden doors at the main entrance swung open. Soft afternoon light flooded in, silhouetting 5 figures marching with purpose down the central aisle. At the head of the group was Stellan. He wore his immaculate dark charcoal suit, his expression set in a mask of total uncompromising authority. On either side of him, 4 federal agents moved in tight formation. Dark tactical jackets bearing their badges prominently on their belts. The crowd of wealthy socialites pulled back at once, pressing against their decorated tables to open a wide path for the approaching officers. The unmistakable reality of federal law enforcement, walking into a billionaire wedding reception, sent a ripple of terrified murmuring through the assembled guests. Stellan stopped exactly 2 feet from where Derek was still on his knees on the marble floor. He regarded the broken groom with mild contempt, before turning his full respectful attention to me. "The warrants are fully secured," Sir Stellan stated, clearly passing a thick stack of official judicial documents to the lead federal agent. "The offshore transfers are locked down, and the identity theft charges have been formally filed with the federal prosecutor." I gave Stellan a single firm nod. Arrest him for aggravated identity theft, massive wire fraud, and extensive financial conspiracy. I said it quietly, but with the absolute finality of a verdict already rendered. The 2 lead agents moved without hesitation. They seized Derek by his expensive suit jacket and hauled him up off the floor. Derek thrashed, immediately panic, overriding whatever physical strength he had left. "No, wait, please, you cannot do this to me." Derek screamed, his voice shattering as the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. "Sloan, tell your father to stop." But Sloan simply turned her face away, folding her arms around herself as tears of profound betrayal slid silently down her cheeks. The agents didn't pause. They spun Derek around and marched him forcefully down the long central aisle of the reception tent. Derek kicked and wailed, his expensive leather shoes skidding uselessly across the polished marble. His desperate, humiliated screaming bounced off the floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers above a perfectly pathetic soundtrack to the complete destruction of everything he had built on fraud. The crowd watched in stunned, breathless silence as the groom was dragged out of his own spectacular wedding and shoved into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. As the heavy doors closed behind the agents, a frantic new energy ignited near the front tables. Renata had pulled herself back from the initial paralysis of shock. She watched the man, who was supposed to be her ticket into high society, get hauled away like a common thief. Her calculating mind worked fast, processing the sudden, catastrophic reversal of everything she had banked on. It hit her within seconds. The poor, uneducated mechanic she had relentlessly belittled and degraded all weekend was, in fact, a titan of industry whose net worth dwarfed anything she had ever allowed herself to imagine. She smoothed her expensive silk dress and pressed a sickeningly sweet, entirely synthetic smile onto her pale face. She practically sprinted across the dance floor, her heels striking loudly against the marble as she made straight for me. "Garrett, darling," Renata breathed, her voice straining under the weight of a warmth she didn't possess. "My goodness, this is all just so overwhelming. Why on earth did you never tell us who you actually were? We could have treated you so much better. We could have arranged something truly magnificent in your honor. We are family after all." I looked directly into her wide, calculating eyes and saw the naked greed swimming just beneath the surface of that pitiful smile. She had no concern whatsoever for the trauma her daughter had just been put through. She felt nothing about the vast criminal conspiracy that had nearly consumed our family. The only thing moving behind those eyes was the fortune she now believed she could somehow get her hands on. I did not return the smile. I let the cold, unsparing truth of this moment settle like a wall between us. "You have never understood what the word family actually means, Renata," I said, my voice dropping to a hard, resonant register that wiped the expression right off her face. "I gave you exactly what you demanded. I played the role you cast me in because it was the only path to dragging the truth into the open. You want to know why I never told you about my wealth? I looked straight through her and let my disgust be visible. Because you love a bank account, Renata. You have never loved a man. You didn't then, and you never will. I turned away from her stunned, pale face, stepped around the ruined wedding cake, and crossed the dance floor to go to my daughter. The vast reception tent, which minutes before had hummed with the chaotic energy of 200 wealthy guests, was draining fast. Elite socialites and opportunistic investors were evacuating the scene of the scandal as quickly as their expensive footwear would allow, whispering in hushed, anxious tones, desperate to put distance between themselves and the spectacular collapse of Derek Ashford. Waiters in white tuxedo shirts quietly retreated through the swinging kitchen doors, abandoning their trays of fine champagne and exotic food. Renata, grasping that her carefully constructed social empire had been reduced to rubble, snatched her designer handbag and nearly ran toward the valet station. She didn't spare a single glance back at her own daughter. Within minutes, the magnificent venue stood essentially empty. The jazz trio had packed up and disappeared. The only sounds left were the soft movement of coastal wind against the heavy canvas walls and the quiet rhythmic sound of someone weeping. I walked slowly across the polished marble, my steel-toed work boots producing a hollow echo in the vast, deserted space. The great chandelier above threw its warm golden light over the wreckage of the reception. Sloane was alone at a large dining table, her white wedding gown pooling around her on the floor, a cruel contrast to the devastation written across her face. She wasn't crying over Derek. She was far too intelligent for that. The brutal truth of his deception had already dismantled whatever illusion he had wrapped around her. What was tearing her apart was shame. She had watched him grind a fistful of wedding cake into my face. She had watched her mother demean me the entire weekend. She had been utterly blind to the predator standing right at her side, and she had let the one person who genuinely loved her be treated as though he were worthless. I pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. The frosting still staining my suit didn't matter, nor did the ruin of my collar. I just looked at my daughter and waited for her to find her words. She raised her head slowly. Her eyes were swollen, and red flooded with a grief that cut right through me. She looked at me, truly looked at me, seeing past the worn clothes and the rough hands for the first time in years. Dad," she whispered, her voice so unsteady she could barely push the words out. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was completely blind to all of it. I let them treat you like you were nothing. I got so swept up in the fantasy, the dresses, the venues, the whole beautiful lie that I couldn't even see what he really was. I didn't protect you. I should have stood up for you. I didn't lecture her. I didn't bring up the quiet warnings I had tried to offer her. Over the months, the gentle doubts I had raised about Derek and his hollow charm. The events of this day had already handed her the harshest education of her life. Instead, I reached out and drew her into a long, warm embrace. She pressed her face into my shoulder and let herself cry fully while I held her close. I rested my chin against her hair and gave her what she needed most in that moment, something solid that wasn't going anywhere. "I never hid my money to hurt you, Sloane," I said quietly, my voice carrying no anger, no resentment, nothing but steadiness. "I hid it because I wanted to protect you from exactly the kind of man he turned out to be. When people know you have serious wealth, they stop seeing you. They stop seeing a smart, beautiful young woman, and they begin to see an unlocked door. They build an entire identity just to get past it. I wanted you to build something real, connections rooted in who you are, not in what you're worth. I wanted someone to love you for your heart, not for your generational trust fund. Derek was a predator, and predators are extraordinarily good at wearing the right disguise. You weren't foolish, sweetheart. You were trusting, and he turned your trusting nature into a weapon against you." Sloane slowly drew back from the embrace and wiped her tear-streaked cheeks with the back of her hand. She looked down at the bare spot on her ring finger, then reached into the small silk clutch resting on the table. She lifted out the large, sparkling engagement ring Derek had placed there with so many empty promises. She studied the polished glass stone, and a quiet revulsion moved across her face. She extended her hand and set the fake ring in my open palm. "Take it?" she said, her voice finding a little more strength behind it, carrying a new and quiet resolve. "I never want to see it again." I closed my fingers around the worthless piece of glass and slipped it into my pocket. I rose and held out my hand. "Time to go home, Sloane," I said gently. "The illusion is done. It's time to step back into the real world." She took my hand, gathered the heavy skirts of her custom gown, and got to her feet. We walked away from the empty tables, the shattered crystal, and the ruined cake together. We walked out of the grand hollow palace Derek had constructed with stolen money and forged signatures. The warm coastal sun was easing toward the horizon, spreading a deep orange and purple blaze across the sky. The manicured grounds were completely deserted. We passed the empty valet station and made our way to the rear service parking lot. My battered 2003 Chevy Silverado sat exactly where I had left it that morning. It looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the massive stone estate, but to me it looked like everything that was right in the world. I pulled open the heavy passenger door. The hinges gave their familiar creak in the quiet evening air. Sloane climbed in her expensive wedding dress, spreading across the worn, cracked vinyl seat. I closed her door, walked around the hood, and settled into the driver's seat. I put the key in and turned it. The old V8 fired with a deep, resonant rumble that moved through the whole frame of the truck. Out there in that empty, silent lot, that rough, unrefined engine sound was the finest thing I had heard all day. We rolled out of the service entrance and headed down the coastal highway, leaving the fraud, the deception, and the hollow world of Renata and Derek entirely in our wake. The months that followed that explosive day were a season of real necessary healing for my daughter. We spent long stretches of time together on the porch of my quiet home, coffee in hand, rebuilding what we had between us, from the foundation up, free at last, from Derek's poison and Renata's suffocating vanity. Sloane finally began to rediscover who she actually was. She came to work alongside me at Wynn Enterprises, learning the true mechanics of our global operations from the ground level up. She came to understand that genuine success had nothing to do with rented sports cars or glass engagement rings. It was built through patient dedication, uncompromising integrity, and honest work. She took control of her trust fund, establishing firm legal protections to ensure she could never again be made vulnerable to a financial predator. As for Derek Ashford, the federal justice system dismantled his entire existence completely. The documentation we handed over was utterly devastating, impossible to argue against. He faced a stack of federal charges covering massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. The violent syndicate he had gone crawling to for money came under heavy scrutiny as well, triggering a sweeping crackdown on their illegal lending operations. Derek was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. There were no designer suits or expensive champagne waiting for him there. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. That means more than you know. Looking back on everything that happened, I won't pretend it didn't leave marks. Watching my daughter stand at that altar, beautiful and completely deceived, cost me something I will never fully name. But I believe God does not allow that kind of pain without a purpose behind it. The waiting, the silence, the humiliation, none of it was wasted. It was all preparation. And when the moment finally arrived, I was ready. Here is what this story taught me and what I hope it offers you. First, never reveal your full hand to people who have already shown you who they are. Let them underestimate you. It is one of the most powerful advantages you will ever have. Second, if someone close to you is being deceived, the loudest warning in the world will not save them. Patience and proof will. Gather both before you move. Third, the people who mistake your quietness for weakness will eventually create the very stage on which you expose them. You do not have to build that stage yourself, just be ready to walk onto it. Fourth, protect the ones you love not just with your words, but with your preparation. Love without strategy leaves the people you care about exposed. If this family revenge story spoke to something in you, if you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated like you didn't matter by people who should have known better, I want you to share it. Pass it along to someone in your life who needs to hear that quiet strength is still strength. For my fellow adults, 50 plus, who have lived long enough to know that real power rarely announces itself, this one was for you. Leave a comment and tell me what moment hit you hardest. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people who deserve it.